One of the most pertinent issues of the modern world is the issue of tribalism. It's basically a part of the human experience at this point. Politics, sports, social media, everyday hobbies, your minimum wage job, even academic and scientific fields often get a considerable taste of tribalism. But tribalism is nothing new. It is a prehistoric impulse which has vexed humanity for as far back as we have records. In certain contexts, it can bring positive psychological effects and advantages. And yet, those same benefits and advantages are also the source of its weakness. For as many positives as there are to tribalism, there are an equal, if not greater, number of drawbacks. And in more than one case, those drawbacks have been at the heart of some of the greatest atrocities humanity has ever witnessed. The tragic flaw of humans, tribalism, can either save us or destroy us. I am your host, Sebastian Rey, and this is the List Podcast, a podcast where each episode checks off an item from a bucket list of ideas I want to share with the world before I die. In this episode, I'm going to be discussing the concept of tribalism, what it is, why it appears, where it appears, how its reach extends further than most realize, how it continues to create problems in many areas of life, as well as what we can do about it. I'll start by describing what I think tribalism is. Tribalism is defined in Webster's dictionary as tribal consciousness and loyalty, or strong in-group loyalty. But if that's all there was to it, I wouldn't be doing a whole episode on it. No, I think it goes much further than that. In my opinion, tribalism is first and foremost a survival instinct. Yes, I do think evolutionary instincts are real, and that humans have them, and that both nature and nurture affect psychology. If you want to hear my full opinion on this, go listen to my Red Pill episode. Anyway, one of the reasons that humans have been able to stay alive for millennia is because of our ability to form tribes. Back when we were living in the wilderness and had to hunt for food, sticking with the tribe often meant the difference between life and death. Without a tribe, you are alone and more vulnerable, and there's no one around to help you if something does happen to you. On top of that, a tribe can also help you fill in knowledge gaps. If one person knows how to hunt but not cook, and another person knows how to cook but not hunt, having these two people in the same tribe creates a synergistic relationship. Furthermore, there's just the obvious fact that a group of people can accomplish tasks that a person alone will have a harder time with. Of course, today, things are a bit different. Technological innovation has enabled many of us to survive without needing a tribe in the classic sense. But that doesn't mean our evolutionary tendency towards tribalism has just gone away. Given that tribes were so essential to our survival for such a long time, it makes sense that we would have developed genetic predispositions which motivate us to form tribe-like groups and focus on loyalty to that group. Some tribes might be more formal and purpose-built, such as a military unit or a sports team, but other tribes might be more loose, such as an online community or the band of friends you grew up with. On top of that, most people today still have tribes consisting of immediate family members and romantic partners. Regardless, one can argue that tribes still exist today, they've just taken on different forms. Your relationships and perceptions regarding particular tribes in your life will dictate a lot about you, and will determine many of your default behaviors and thought patterns, whether or not you realize it. The ways in which you talk, the things you think are funny, the way you react to things, even your beliefs, though you might not think about it, are affected by whatever tribe or tribes are most influential in your life. If you start hanging around a new tribe, this can also cause you to change how you behave. One of the more fascinating aspects of human psychology is how people will shift the ways in which they talk and act to match the tribe they're currently in, or that they believe they're in. You can call this chameleon behavior, but I've seen many people do it. It is a very rare individual who's exactly the same around every single person and doesn't adjust themselves in any way to match their environment. You call it being a chameleon. I call it the integration effect. And I think the integration effect doesn't just impact the way you talk around others, but can quite literally affect you at a psychological level, shifting your emotional responses and thought patterns as well. But that's a subject for a different episode. In any case, I think tribalism and many of the smaller behaviors around it are evolutionary in origin. I believe there is an ancient instinctual reward system in most people's brain which rewards you for being accepted by tribes, accomplishing things for tribes, and having status within a tribe, while also punishing you for being rejected by tribes or being outside of a tribe. Of course, like I stated in the Red Pill episode, I don't believe that nature works by making everyone exactly the same. There will always be people who don't have these instincts, as well as people who are less affected by them. However, I believe that ancient tribal reward system exists at some basic level in most people's brains at birth. And I also think that reward system is an underlying reason behind a very large percent of human behavior. For example, it's possible that one of the reasons for social anxiety is because of our relationship with tribes. Why is it that a person would develop the irrational fear of public embarrassment or humiliation? Embarrassment can't hurt you physically, so why would anyone be afraid of it? Maybe it's because embarrassment or humiliation signifies rejection from the tribe. And if it's true that our animal brain perceives rejection from the tribe as akin to death, it makes sense that we would want to avoid embarrassment and humiliation. We might have even developed psychological mechanisms such as social anxiety to help prevent us from entering situations which could end in embarrassment or humiliation. Depression and loneliness, in some cases, might also be connected to our tribal instinct. Why would you need to feel lonely? In the modern day, people don't necessarily need a connection to others to survive, so why is loneliness still a thing? Maybe it's because there's a system in your brain which rewards you for feeling like you're part of a tribe, and punishes you for being outside of one. Loneliness could potentially be part of that. Or maybe the tribe you're part of is one you don't identify with very strongly. How about depression? Well, the truth is, people can feel depressed for many reasons, but oftentimes people feel most chronically depressed when they lack a sense of purpose. What is the main thing that's given man purpose for the majority of human existence? It's having a role in a tribe or accomplishing things for a tribe. When you aren't accomplishing things you perceive as important, depression can come out of this. The formation of close friendships may also be connected to tribalism. Why is it that when you become close friends with someone, there's an unspoken but almost expected loyalty which goes along with that friendship? There are millions of people we could be friends with, so why do we get so attached to friends and so hurt when they leave us or go against us in some way? It may have to do with the loyalty instinct. Loyalty was a big part of ancient tribes, because without loyalty, you don't really have a tribe at all. In those times, a lack of loyalty meant the tribe wouldn't stick together. And again, if the tribe couldn't stick together, that essentially meant death. When a friend betrays us or leaves us, even if no physical damage has been done, I think it strikes at a deep part of our evolutionary psychology which pertains to tribal loyalty. Romantic bonding may also be related to tribalism. Why is it that after people have sex, it's extremely common to feel a sense of attachment? This may also have to do with our instinct to form tribes. When you have babies with someone, you're creating a lineage. You're introducing someone new into the family and into the tribe. Well, if babies are a huge part of what keeps tribes going, and if sex is generally required to have babies, it would make sense for there to be a sort of bonding mechanism in the brain which goes along with sex, at least for a large percent of people. Just like many other components of tribalism, that bonding mechanism may exist in order to maintain tribal cohesion and loyalty. That same sense of attachment may also be the reason why it hurts to get cheated on. Racism, although it's uncomfortable to talk about, may often have to do with tribalism. In ancient times, tribes were almost always made up of people of the same race. The only exception to this was if one tribe conquered and integrated a tribe of a different race. If it's true that tribalism is largely evolved, it would make sense for there to be a psychological mechanism which causes people to identify members of the same race as potentially being part of the tribe, and members of a different race as potentially being part of an outgroup. Just because our society today is much more assimilated than ever before, it doesn't mean that instinct is gone. Tribalism even plays into gang culture. Yes, gangs like Bloods and Crips and Yakuza. If you take an in-depth look at the behavior of gangs, you can see obvious aspects of tribalism woven into how they conduct themselves and the ways in which they operate. In fact, gangs may be one of the most unadulterated forms of tribalism that exists in the modern day. For example, gangs reward loyalty and punish disloyalty in extreme ways. If you're dealing with a real cold-blooded gang, being disloyal will easily get you killed. One of the biggest sins in gang culture is being a rat. But people who are loyal get lots of benefits, like money or protection, or maybe even protection for your family if you have one. And if a loyal gang member gets killed, the other members will generally try to take revenge in order to honor the fallen member. Speaking of honor, it's a huge component of many gangs as well. In that world, if you don't have honor or respect among other members, you're basically a nobody. This is yet another hallmark of tribalism. Ancient tribes often required you to continually prove your worth, especially if you were a man, because in those times, skill, competence, and reliability meant the difference between life and death. If you couldn't rely on your friends to have your back, you might not get to eat, or you might not come home at all. Tribes living in subsistence needed a way of enforcing competence and reliability. The concepts of honor and respect may have come out of that. To have honor or respect within a gang, you typically have to prove yourself in some way, and continue proving yourself with the way you live. Why is it that many people will excuse their own parents or children for wrongdoing, but if someone else committed those same actions, it would be seen as unacceptable? Well, tribal instincts may cause many people to treat direct genetic relationships, such as parent-child relationships, with a large degree of favoritism. Left versus right politics, as we all know, is rife with tribalism, even when both sides are not telling the whole truth. And even when confronted with the truth, in many cases, people who are dug into one side of a political issue will refuse to acknowledge or admit it. This is significant because it tells us that tribal instincts are not necessarily limited to genetically related family members, but can extend to more abstract things. It also tells us that tribalism affects how people process information. We know many ideological spaces have a tribalistic component to them. Many online groups will swiftly shut out and ban people who don't share similar beliefs. Even fans of online influencers often have parasocial attachments to those influencers. It could be because on some level, they want to be part of that person's tribe. Regardless, tribalism is all over the place. I would argue that unless you're living in isolation, there's no place on Earth you can go where tribalism doesn't exist in some form or fashion. Now, many of us are aware of the bad parts of tribalism, but not many people talk about the other side of that coin. There are undeniably psychological benefits to feeling like you are accepted, even loved, by a tribe, or accomplishing useful things for a tribe, or having an important role within a tribe. If you think about it, there are many parts of human life today which can be viewed from one of these perspectives. Why are so many people obsessed with finding like-minded groups that agree with their views and propensities? Why do people stay loyal to those groups even when they're in the wrong? Why do so many people seek power or fame? Why do prominent comedians keep saying that the feeling of killing a crowd is an irreplaceable feeling? Why do so many people view marriage or relationships as an ideal to reach for? Do people like these things and act in these ways because of how bad it feels? Before talking about how terrible tribalism is and how many aspects of tribalism are destructive, we have to admit that there's a reason people are like this in the first place. There are incredibly powerful emotional hooks to many of the components of tribalism. If all of these things felt bad or had no emotional content, no one would do this stuff. But they don't feel bad, do they? If you want to know the real reason tribalism persists, it's because of how powerful the emotions attached to it are. These emotions are such a big part of human motivation that you could argue our psychology is practically built around them. And if that's not the case, one could be forgiven for thinking that it is. Also, the psychological benefits which come from tribalism aren't necessarily limited to just emotions. Having a connection with a tribe of people can have a regulating effect on actual mental illnesses. Someone who is prone to mania or catastrophic thinking or extreme emotional swings can often become more stable over time by simply having everyday communication with people who genuinely care about them, as long as those people aren't playing into their mental illness. This might seem insignificant to some, but think about that. No drug or medical practice we've ever invented has been able to consistently cure mental illness, but something which was invented thousands of years ago can, at least for certain mental conditions. It should tell us something about what the brain is built for. On top of that, let's not forget that having a tribe around you can literally save your life. By yourself, you are an easier target for bad guys who want to take advantage of people, but when you're in a group of people, you're a harder target. A tribe of people can also help you out if you're in a tight spot. There's a reason why militaries don't send soldiers to fight by themselves. When being part of a tribe has that many benefits, it makes sense why people would go to such extreme lengths to protect their tribe or protect their place within the tribe. Another component of tribalism that needs to be addressed is the concept of hierarchies. It's an uncomfortable truth, but tribes, even today, almost always form hierarchies, even though in the modern day those hierarchies are often unspoken. The reason why human tribes form natural hierarchies is because of two things: the human propensity to attain dominance, and the human propensity to follow those they perceive as dominant. What is dominance? Well, I explained this at more length in the Red Pill episode, but basically, dominance is contextual. Each group and each culture has their own version of what it means to be dominant. Being dominant in the world of swimmers is very different from being dominant in the world of politics. However, there are two things that are always true about dominance. Number one is that dominance is inherently exclusionary, meaning it is not logically possible for every person to be dominant. Imagine if everyone in the world had exactly $1 million. Would everyone be rich? The answer, if you think about it, is no. If everyone had $1 million would be the average. For you to be rich, you have to have more money than the average. Ultimately, that's what being rich means, at least in the world of finance. It means having more money than everyone else. In the same way, it's not possible for everyone to be dominant. By definition, dominance requires you to be above others in some way. For you to dominate, there must be something which is dominated. Well, when we observe tribes, either today or in the past, we always see hierarchies of some sort. And when we observe those hierarchies, we always see figures who are more dominant and figures who are less dominant. In other words, tribes generally have leaders and followers. Sometimes the leadership hierarchy is obvious, sometimes it's more hidden, sometimes dominance itself is more a spectrum. But in any case, hierarchies seem to materialize in every tribe. Even the most progressive groups you can find today have people who generally lead the conversations within that group and people who generally follow what others are doing. The second thing we know about dominance is that across the world there are extremely common signals that humans tend to view as signs of dominance, such as confidence, assertiveness, fearlessness, strength, and straightforwardness. Sometimes intelligence is a sign of dominance, but not always. The most intelligent people in a society are not always viewed or treated as dominant, but are sometimes subordinates, depending on what the group or culture values. Certain body language characteristics can also signal dominance. For instance, someone who looks you dead in the eye when talking to you is more likely to be perceived as dominant than someone who constantly looks away. The tone of voice you speak in can also play into it. A person who projects their voice is more likely to be perceived as dominant than someone who speaks softly and timidly. People can deny it all they want, but dominance signals are nearly universal in their appearance. A confident person, as long as they don't come across as threatening, can walk into a bar in nearly any part of the world and is much more likely to be treated well than someone who is not confident. We all know it. The question is, why? Well, if these dominance signals are so instinctive and so universal, if people in every culture respond to dominance signals without even thinking about it, it suggests a genetic origin. In other words, it is likely the case that a large percent of our brain's tribal reward system centers around identifying and playing into hierarchies. All tribes need some kind of a direction or common purpose. So who decides the direction of the tribe? Who chooses what things the group should value or what goals they should pursue? You can try to make all decisions by democracy, but unfortunately, democracy does not work in every single aspect of life, nor can it be implemented at all times. Ancient tribes had hierarchies because it was simply the easiest way to orient tribes. Different people have different predispositions and abilities. Some people have a mind more suited for planning and decision-making. For other people, it's simply easier to follow the one with the plan. So what tribes have always done is given leadership positions to those who seem to be more suited for it. Not everyone can be a leader, because then there's no one for you to lead. And not everyone can be a follower, because for you to follow, there must be someone you are following. Furthermore, certain types of behaviors have always been associated with leadership, and certain types of behaviors have always been associated with being a follower. Confidence is a trait that the vast majority of leaders had to have, otherwise they wouldn't be able to carry themselves or others through difficult situations. It is a trait born from necessity. Physical strength and capability is also associated with leadership for a similar reason. At the same time, followers and people who are generally more vulnerable have always had more neurotic traits, such as anxiety. Believe it or not, this is also adaptive. Because weaker people are less able to fight, they must be ready to flee in case of overwhelming odds. Anxiety prepares you for this. Although many cultures view fleeing as cowardly, it's undeniably true that running away from danger has helped many of our ancestors live to see the next day. The point is, all tribes throughout history have had hierarchies, and specific psychological and behavioral profiles have always been associated with specific positions in the hierarchy. Our brains may have evolved to recognize and be attuned to these behaviors. There are many people who feel a sense of reward when someone they look up to accepts them or validates them. In fact, some people live for that feeling. Maybe what their brain is really doing is rewarding them for being a successful follower. Or how about this? Why are some people extremely dogmatic about following rules, even in the cases where rules don't make sense, even when the rules actively harm their own interests? Maybe this is also an example of the brain rewarding follower behavior. At the same time, there are other people who seem to have ceaseless ambition. Why could that be? Well, maybe certain people's brains reward them for seeking dominant positions and elevating their status in society. That status could come from building something, or it could come from sheer Machiavellianism. In every society, there are also folks who are jealous of those with status. Again, this may happen because our brains are sensitive to hierarchies. Some people want to be a follower, but some people want to be a leader. It all depends on your own predispositions and personality traits, as well as how you were conditioned. But power dynamics seem to be baked into our brain's reward system. This is why it's silly that certain people today believe we can get rid of human hierarchies. Arguably, hierarchies are intertwined with tribalism and with the brain itself. Ideally, there's a balance to it. In a well-functioning society, leaders don't just have power for no reason. They must have the skills and intelligence to be there, and they must also take on added risk and be willing to take responsibility for negative outcomes. And ideally, followers aren't just victims. They're in that position because it suits their personality. Some people think they're going to be leaders, but find out the hard way that they're not cut out for it. Other people might be followers for most of their lives, but by happenstance find themselves in a situation where they have to lead. And yes, sometimes leadership hierarchies are totally corrupt and destructive, but there has never been a human society that had no hierarchies whatsoever. Trying to get rid of hierarchies would be like trying to stop everyone in the world from having sex. It just goes against every human instinct. But while these instincts might be practically impossible to get rid of, they still pose a problem for modern living. Many problems, in fact, because as we all know, there are many negative things associated with tribalism. One of the most common ways that tribalism negatively impacts us is through regular conversations and interactions. People's tendency toward tribalism leads to a lot of motivated reasoning. What is motivated reasoning? It just means thinking about things and reasoning through problems with an end goal in mind. Motivated reasoning is almost like the opposite of critical thinking. Critical thinking attempts to find flaws in one's own views. Motivated reasoning attempts to confirm one's own views through rhetorical tricks, logical fallacies, and perspective gimmicks. Everyone knows what confirmation bias is. Well, confirmation bias is just one type of motivated reasoning. The issue is, the vast majority of people use motivated reasoning. You probably do it. How do I know? Because everyone has biases, and biases are the main cause for motivated reasoning. It is extremely common for people to give more weight to information and ideas which give them answers they prefer, while ignoring or downplaying things which go against their beliefs. Even people in the scientific community do this. Believe it or not, it is common for people in the scientific world to become attached to ideas and focus on research and theories which agree with their pre-existing beliefs. Some people will even go so far as to skew the way they do research in order to get certain results. This is certainly true in the soft sciences, but it can also be true in the hard sciences as well. So if you thought scientists were just these expert geniuses who are above human error, who approach knowledge from a purely analytical standpoint, I hate to break it to you, they're just people. And people, it seems, love being tribalistic. A good scientist is aware that they can be wrong, and is constantly questioning their own assumptions and wondering whether their theories tell the whole truth. The worst scientist is one who has already decided what they believe and needs you to agree with them. But even the most dedicated scientist will still give in to their own biases every once in a while. They can't help it. It's only human. It is actually unnatural not to have biases. Calling any person unbiased is like calling the water in the ocean non-liquid. Rather than trying to be unbiased, the best anyone can do is to admit their biases and work from there. When a person can't admit their own biases, that's where distrust sets in. This is why you should be skeptical of anyone who tells you to trust a person or any man-made thing unconditionally. What they're really telling you is to trust the people who made that thing, whose biases are often hidden. The point is, tribalism affects pretty much everyone. The only way to counter your own tribalistic instincts is to constantly work against them by being willing to be wrong, by being willing to question your deepest beliefs, and by continually going outside of your comfort zone to seek out ideas which might go against your instincts and preferences. And this is a lifelong struggle, because the human desire for bonding, connection, and comfort is always there. This is one of the reasons why tribalism is so common, because not giving in to your tribalistic tendencies requires constant effort and vigilance, and most people simply aren't willing to put in that much effort, especially when there's no perceived benefit for doing so. But simply letting tribalism take over also has a cost. When people are too locked into tribalism, they will often defend or excuse their tribes even when those tribes are clearly in the wrong, and even when their defenses and excuses aren't logical. One thing tribalism tends to do is blind us to our own flaws and the flaws of our tribe. This leads to a lot of cases where one group of people will criticize another group while simultaneously engaging in the exact same behavior or a similar behavior. Some people are perfectly aware of their own flaws, but refuse to acknowledge them or do anything about them for fear of being disloyal to the tribe. The thing is, we all know people are like this, so why do we have such a hard time stopping this behavior? I think it's because of just how powerful tribalism is when it comes to shaping perception. It's always easy to see the problems with other people's tribes because you're looking at them from the outside. Not being a part of someone's tribe can give you a more quote-unquote objective or detached view, which sometimes allows you to see things they can't. But when our tribe is the one in the wrong, tribal instincts often prevent us from seeing it at all, and if we do see it, it can be extremely hard to admit because our instinct is to be loyal. In many cases, being against tribalism requires you to be against your own emotions. But the problems with tribalism go even further than that. When tribes start to compete with one another, it can turn into violence, malice, revenge, war, and can lead to many innocent lives being destroyed. Some tribal competition is harmless. Two sports teams competing against one another on a level playing field usually do not become violent. But when it comes to other types of tribes, such as nations or governments fighting for power, that competition can very quickly turn deadly. As long as tribalism has existed, tribal competition has also existed. The reason for this competition may be a survival instinct. If one tribe has a whole bunch of food but your tribe is starving, and you're living in the jungle where morality doesn't apply, it might make sense to attack the other tribe and take their food. But of course, the kind of tribal competition we've seen across history is not just competition for resources. We know tribes of the past would attack each other to take control of land, or capture women, or enslave their opponents. Some tribes would go to lengths just to annihilate and destroy each other, or for revenge. The same things still happen today, just in a more modern context. This tells us that if tribal competition was initially about survival, at this point it has extended far beyond its purpose. The worst tragedies mankind has ever experienced, arguably, were a result of tribal competition. And yet, at the same time, the tribal instinct to conquer, when used productively, has also led to the greatest inventions in all of history. Every amazing technology and innovation we rely on today, the combustion engine, flight, GPS technology, the internet, every useful mathematical theory, did not originate purely from altruism. It's undeniably true that the vast majority of inventors, explorers, technologists, and scientific innovators throughout history were on some level motivated by selfish interests. I believe that much of human ambition from an evolutionary standpoint stems from a desire to conquer some aspect of nature, which ultimately stems from the human desire for dominance. Think about it. It makes very little sense to devote one's entire life and energy to the discovery of some new technology or theory, not knowing if you'll be successful, unless there's some potential reward you get out of it as well. We'd all like to believe that the best acts come from selflessness, and it is true that selflessness can be very beneficial. But we all know that true selflessness and self-sacrifice is a rarity. Most of the time, humans act in self-interested ways. This isn't necessarily a bad thing either. Every person has to be selfish on some level simply to survive. Also, even when someone acts in a selfless manner, we all forget that there's still someone on the receiving end of that selflessness. A person helping and a person being helped. And the person being helped must be selfish enough to accept the help they're being given. But I'm getting off topic. In the end, tribalism has significant upsides, but huge downsides. So what should we do about it? If tribalism is, for all intents and purposes, impossible to get rid of, and if tribalism creates this many problems for the modern world, how can we mitigate its negative effects? Is there anything we can do to keep tribalism from destroying us completely? Well, the way I see it, there are several possible solutions. Some of them might work some of the time, but most likely none of them will work all of the time, which means it will be necessary to continually adjust our approach. The first solution is technically something we already tried in America, with limited success, and that is to make people aware of our metaphysical connection to each other. As the hippies of the 70s realized, it is technically true that, as humans, we are all connected to each other in some abstract sense. When two people acknowledge each other's humanity instead of dehumanizing each other, this can give you a common ground to work off of in order to resolve disputes. In some cases, simply recognizing that you have something in common is enough to stop people from fighting. However, as I said before, this solution has only had limited success. Like I explained in the last episode, different groups of people throughout the world have different values and different moral systems. In many cases, disagreements and disputes can't be stopped by just sharing some common ground. In many cases, the disagreements between people are more existential than that. In fact, many of the big wars in human history were moral in nature. Different groups of people have totally different ideas about what's right and wrong. And when those ideas simply can't be reconciled, violence becomes the last and only thing you can use to determine which moral system will reign. If you believe that you have every right to sell drugs, but your neighborhood cop believes they have to put you in jail, it will eventually come down to physical force to determine whose morals are applied. If a certain group believes you or your tribe must be killed at all costs, and you believe you must defend yourself at all costs, this moral difference can only be resolved one way. When people's disagreements are strong enough, especially when those disagreements have to do with morality, you won't just make people put away their differences with a puff of weed and some nice-sounding platitudes. Another problem with the hippie approach is that people are more likely to flock towards tribalism when experiencing fear or uncertainty. It is true that people, some of the time, are capable of being rational, but as soon as emotions get involved, it seems tribal instincts are always the default. It doesn't matter how many drugs you've done, or how many hours a day you meditate. The only time rationality seems to succeed at scale is in high-trust environments where survival is certain for most people. In low-trust environments where survival is more uncertain, people are far less likely to be rational and more likely to cling to tribalism. And unfortunately, high-trust societies with high economic certainty have proven extremely challenging to maintain over long periods of time. All societies go through periods of highs and lows, periods of ease and periods of fear. During fear, tribalism is typically the default. It's just how our brains are built. So aside from the hippie approach, what's another solution to the negative aspects of tribalism? Well, it's possible that we could try to use genetic engineering to alter the brain, so that people do not have or respond to tribalistic instincts the way we do now. In other words, scientists could figure out how to completely rewire the brain's emotional reward system. But this would be an extremely difficult thing to do, and getting everyone to agree to it would be even harder. But even if you could accomplish such a grand and fantastic undertaking, who knows what unforeseen consequences would come from it? What would human society look like without the emotions we have now? Would it even look human? Or would it look robotic and lifeless? Just like pain, emotions serve a survival purpose. Would a person without traditional emotions be capable of taking care of themselves? Would they even want to live? Would a tribalist society be something people want at all? Maybe some would, but I strongly suspect that not everyone would be on board with it. And what do you do with the people who aren't on board with it? Do you force them to get their brains altered? Who gets to decide that? Who's in charge of this tribalist, emotionless society, and what are their motives? Do they have to undergo the surgery, or do they get special privileges? Getting rid of tribal instincts from the brain sounds like it might be a good idea, until you start exploring the implications of such a thing. The last solution, and in my opinion the only solution that is going to be viable over the long term, is to work around it. If it's not possible to get rid of tribalism without extreme or ethically questionable measures, then the only thing we can really do is to accept that people are tribalistic and figure out a way to structure society around it. What we absolutely should not do is continue pretending that we can just talk people out of tribalism, or even worse, pretend tribalism isn't real. So if people are going to be tribal, maybe it would make sense to allow people to segregate themselves according to tribe. I explained this idea in the last episode, but I'll explain it again. Let's say you have a town where only black people live, and they want to vote to turn that town into a black-only town. I think they should be allowed to do that. And that segregated region should be protected under the law, meaning that no one, not the federal government, not foreigners, not anyone, should be allowed to come in and insert a whole bunch of white people into that town. As a black-only town, no one other than black people should be allowed to move there, plain and simple. It's a legally protected region, and if you want to change it, the people who live in that region must get together and vote on the changes. So if the people of Blacktown want to keep their town as a black-only town, they'll have to get actively involved in their own local politics. Right now, we have a state-based system. Basically, each state is able to pass its own laws and govern itself somewhat separate from the federal government. But I think the state system no longer makes sense. Back when the US was first formed, states did not have nearly as many people as they do now. The original idea behind a state was to have regions in the US where people who shared common values would be able to govern themselves to some extent. But times have changed, and states are simply too big to perform that function. Now each state in the US can easily have millions of people living there, which means people from the same state are not all going to know each other or share common values. A state can no longer represent the beliefs of the people that live there because the people that live in each state are too numerous and too mixed in what they believe. This is why I think the state system should be abandoned altogether, and all the rights that states have now should be given to cities and towns. On top of that, I think people should be allowed to form their own towns and cities on the basis of race, religion, sex, or any other common affinity, and these towns and cities should be legally protected. Each town and city should, on some level, be able to govern themselves and have their own laws and voting system. The irony is, you wouldn't really be able to call it the United States anymore. But I think this system would be better for many reasons. It would allow people to form their own tribes. It would incentivize people to get involved in the politics of their area. People would have much more power over what goes on in their area. And ultimately, many people would be happier because they wouldn't be surrounded by anonymous citygoers, but by people with shared interests. Rather than having a giant impersonal state where millions of people live and you don't know any of them, my system would allow you to find people like you, and if there are enough of you, you can form your own legally protected group and claim a particular spot in America, as long as there's room and as long as your tribe keeps voting to stay together. As I mentioned in the last episode, I call this the common neighbor system. Of course, a lot would have to change in order to implement the common neighbor system. Housing would have to be a lot cheaper and more accessible. The way things are now, you wouldn't be able to just move a whole bunch of people around without creating a giant housing problem. Most people in the US can't easily afford to just move from where they are with no complications. Also, if you got rid of states altogether, it would drastically change our voting system. Right now, states and state representatives are a huge component of the Electoral College. Getting rid of states entirely would totally upend the way the Electoral College works, and many of the corrupt politicians in high levels of office rely on the current voting system to get elected. I suspect they will do everything in their power to keep that system the way it is. Yes, it's true that having a common neighbor system would not solve every problem. Tribes would still compete, countries would still go to war with other countries, governments would still propagandize and exploit their own citizens. Corporations and financial entities would still have tons of power. But I think allowing for more free association would be one step towards a more peaceful society. In any case, I don't think tribalism is going away. Given how ingrained tribal instincts are in our psychology and everyday lives, I think it's highly unlikely that we will ever get rid of tribalism altogether. Which means the only true end of tribalism would require the end of humanity. So instead of trying to fight it, maybe we should work with it and come up with solutions which account for the human tendency toward tribalism. And that's about it for the episode. I could give you a whole rant, but this episode I'm not going to do that. If you want to check out the other stuff I'm doing, there are links in the description. Whenever the next episode comes out, I'll talk to you then. See you.